The smell hits before the sight. Sour, metallic, a sourness carried on wind that makes the mouth water and narrows the throat. We push up a barren ridge outside Târgoviște, and the plain below reads less like battlefield than like a message. Rows of uprights, hundreds, then thousands, each crowned with a human shape. This is not chaos. It is an engineered display, a forest of stakes arranged to be read at a distance, an argument made of wood and flesh. It was, in its own terrible logic, a weapon. If you want more deep history like this, subscribe. To understand how that forest became Vlad III's signature tactic, and to understand how the same logic may have set the conditions for his final, violent end, we have to trace a path from hostage chambers in the Ottoman court to the forensic traces left in the soil and in the archives. We will follow three strands of evidence: archaeological data from the regions around Târgoviște, contemporary correspondence and military reports from Ottoman and European hands, and the chronicles, often partisan, sometimes rhetorical, that turned a political operator into a legend. Where these streams converge, we can speak with relative confidence. Where they diverge, we mark uncertainty and weigh probabilities. Vlad's formative lesson in spectacle and punishment began long before any impalement forest. As a boy, he and his younger brother Radu were held as hostages at the Ottoman court, removed from home as a political guarantee. In those years, the Ottoman administration treated public punishment as a form of governance, an explicit pedagogy for obedience. Executions, floggings, the public display of criminals, these were not only punitive acts, but performative signals to would-be rebels and to the population at large. Contemporary observers and later historians note that the court was an environment where authority was rehearsed and displayed. Vlad absorbed these lessons. He learned how violence could be calibrated, who to punish, how visibly to punish them, and how to make punishment itself the medium of power. When he returned to Wallachia and took the throne intermittently across the 1450s and 1660s, those lessons were not idle memories. They became method. In 1459, during what later chronicles frame as a clearing of corrupt boyars and internal enemies, Vlad staged a sequence that was disturbingly procedural. Sources, both local accounts and later transcriptions preserved in foreign diplomatic letters, describe selection, confinement, and public execution timed to maximize social shock. Observers record not randomness, but order. Prisoners separated, judged according to their rank, and punished in ways that matched the message intended. The point was not merely to kill, it was to reorganize the incentives of a fractious nobility and to install a new equilibrium of obedience. This is crucial for our reconstruction because it tells us two things. First, Vlad could think in systems. He engineered outcomes. Second, he used visibility as policy. The impalement forest in 1462 was not an improvisation. It was the logical extension of a learned technique. Scale the spectacle, refine its geometry, and calibrate the target audience. The 1462 campaign against the Ottomans is where that calibration becomes tactical. Facing Sultan Mehmed II's forces, Vlad did not simply massacre captives haphazardly. Contemporary letters, Ottoman dispatches, and European diplomats' reports describe how prisoners were selected for visibility. Veterans, officers, men whose faces could be recognized by the enemy. Stakes were arranged not only along roads, but in formations intended to address different ranks and units. Rows visible to infantry. Elevated displays meant to be seen by commanders. The most conspicuous exemplars placed where couriers or scouts would pass. One translated Ottoman dispatch, reported in later archival summaries, records that some riders could not stomach to ride past and that their confidence evaporated. A European envoy wrote that the field was a lesson written in wood, a phrase repeated in multiple continental letters. The mechanics matter. Archaeological reports from sites around Târgoviște and adjacent fields document repeated post-hole alignments. linear trenches with regular spacing suggesting intentional placement rather than random burial. In one published trench report, excavators noted aligned stake sockets, identical in width, set at regular intervals over tens of meters, coupled with stratigraphy indicating rapid, contemporary deposition rather than accumulation across centuries. Soil chemistry samples in the same report showed localized anomalies consistent with decayed organic matter concentrated along those alignments. Osteological evidence is more fragmentary. Isolated human bone fragments, some with perimortem trauma marks consistent with violent death, were recovered in association with disturbed soil layers. Estimates compiled by the excavation team, cautious by necessity, suggest fields that likely held hundreds, possibly into the low thousands, of wooden stakes in organized layouts, numbers that align with witness reports rather than with folkloric exaggeration. This archaeological alignment with archival accounts gives us a grounded picture of how the field functioned. The psychological effect on Ottoman troops is not an invention of later moralists. A set of Ottoman military correspondences, translated and summarized in state records, describe a range of symptoms among soldiers: acute nervousness, refusal to rest where the displays were visible, and in some cases, desertion. One officer's report fragment, cited in contemporary summaries, notes that troops vomited and could not sleep after passing the stakes. Whether these reactions were universal or strategically emphasized in dispatches to explain retreats is open to question. But the combined evidence, field patterns, documentary mentions, and contemporary European observers makes it probable that Vlad's spectacle had immediate tactical effects: delay, hesitation, and a breakdown in cohesion that bought Vlad's forces critical space. This success, however, carried political cost. The very methods that kept Wallachia intact against Ottoman incursions alienated potential allies and sowed fear at home. Hungary, restless about Vlad's unpredictability and fearful of being drawn into open conflict with the Ottomans by a prince whose methods were erratic, arrested him at one point and held him for years. He was restored briefly in 1476 with limited support, a brittle shadow of his former autonomy. By then, the regional balance had shifted. Mehmed II was older but still formidable. Local boyars who had survived past purges nursed grievances. Hungarian and Moldavian diplomacy had its own priorities. In short, the man who had weaponized spectacle now faced a political field that had turned less hospitable. Which brings us to the title, Vlad's Final Battle. What actually happened in the autumn of 1476, and how can we reconstruct it from the fragments that survive? The record is raw and conflicted. In the primary streams, we can identify at least 4 competing scenarios that historians typically weigh. Scenario A: Vlad dies in pitched combat against Ottoman forces during a campaign in late 1476. Several contemporaneous Ottoman chronicles and later Turkish histories assert that a campaign in Wallachia culminated in a direct clash where Vlad was killed on the field. These sources sometimes report that Vlad fell while resisting the Ottoman advance and that his body was left on the field. The evidentiary strength of these claims rests largely on Ottoman narrative consistency. Multiple Ottoman chronicles describe a violent end. But the weakness is that these chronicles were produced within a political culture that prized martial rhetoric and often compressed events into triumph narratives. Archaeological expectation for this scenario would be a battlefield scattering of remains and armor consistent with sudden battle trauma. Yet, we lack a securely identified battlefield grave for Vlad himself. Scenario B: Vlad is betrayed and killed by Wallachian or Hungarian conspirators, an assassination or targeted murder rather than open battle. Some European letters and local chronicles hint at intrigue among the boyars and at Hungarian willingness to remove an unstable ruler. Support for this scenario comes from the politics. Motive is clear. Many at home had reason to rid themselves of a prince whose methods destabilized alliances. The weakness is documentary. Direct, contemporary records naming conspirators or giving eyewitness testimony of a cloak-and-dagger-style killing are thin and often written years later by partisan authors. Forensic expectations here would include small-scale, localized burial or disappearance of a body under suspicious circumstances. Again, there is no identified grave or credible osteological tag to endorse this conclusively. Scenario C. Vlad is killed during a skirmish with returning boyars or local partisans, an internal conflict rather than Ottoman action. This variant is sometimes conflated with B, but it imagines a chaotic, local struggle in which Vlad falls amid irregular combat. Its support is circumstantial. 1476 saw multiple fronts and local actors with the motive and opportunity to strike amid confusion. The evidence gap mirrors the previous scenarios. No conclusive grave, no contemporaneous eyewitness legal record that we can now validate. Scenario D. After capture, Vlad is executed formally and his head is sent to Constantinople as trophy. Decapitation reported by some sources and later repeated in Ottoman and European narratives. This account has the appealingly concrete detail of a trophy, and several chronicles writing in the Ottoman sphere claim precisely that Vlad's head reached Mehmed II. The strength of these claims lies partly in motive. Heads as trophies were a known practice aimed at symbolic demoralization, and partly in narrative consistency across some later texts. The weakness is the lack of decisive physical proof. No authenticated skull or grave has been identified as Vlad's, and contemporaries often used such trophy stories rhetorically. Forensic logic asks, if a head were sent to Constantinople, would a corresponding record, inventory, palace chronicle, or burial account survive? There are mentions in later compilations, but no indisputable catalog entry that names Vlad's head. How do we weigh these scenarios using forensic criteria? For each, we ask three standard questions: who had motive, who had means, and who had opportunity. We then ask what physical evidence we would expect and whether it exists. Motive. All four scenarios carry motive. Mehmed II and his commanders had clear motive to eliminate a disruptive client. Boyars and Hungarian actors had equally clear motive to remove an erratic prince. Means. Ottoman forces had the military means. Conspirators had the stealth and local advantage. Rival partisans had access to the terrain and local knowledge. Opportunity. The chaotic campaigns of 1476 certainly created windows for all of the above. Expected physical evidence. A battlefield death, A, should leave a scatter consistent with open combat. Capture and decapitation, D, should leave documentary traces in Ottoman administrative records. Betrayal, B/C, would likely result in limited funerary record or clandestine burial.
What we actually have is a sparse physical record, a lack of a confirmed grave for Vlad, and a set of narratives that are internally inconsistent. This absence of a smoking bullet osteological signature pushes us toward probabilistic reasoning rather than certainty. We can say with reasonable confidence that Vlad died violently in late 1476 during a brief restoration effort. That conclusion rests on the convergence of chronicle dates, diplomatic correspondence noting his return and sudden disappearance, and the political context that makes natural death implausible. Beyond the fact of a violent and likely sudden death, however, the precise mechanism eludes ironclad proof. If pressed for a most probable reconstruction, we would argue the following chain of reasoning. First, capture and formal execution with the sending of a head to Constantinople is plausible and consistent with Ottoman trophy practices. Some Ottoman and Turkish chronicles support this, and the rhetorical utility of such a trophy suits the imperial narrative. Second, battlefield death in the chaos of 1466 remains plausible. Ottoman chronicles record a clash and the death of a leader. Third, betrayal or assassination at the hands of domestic rivals is also plausible, given the boyars' motives and the precedent of internecine violence in Wallachia. Which is most consistent with the full sweep of available evidence? Taking documentary weight and political logic together, the scenario that best fits the balance of probabilities is that Vlad died violently, either killed in combat or shortly thereafter in a targeted act, and that his head, whether as proof of death or as a trophy, was conveyed to Ottoman authorities. We mark this as most likely, not because we possess a matching skull in a museum drawer, but because the political motive, the narrative patterns in Ottoman sources, and the absence of a domestic burial all tip probabilities toward violent death followed by trophy handling. We must be explicit about confidence levels. The fact of a violent death in late 1416, high probability. The precise mechanics, spear in battle, dagger by conspirator, formal decapitation and public sending to Constantinople, probable for decapitation as trophy, given multiple narrative attestations, but not certain. Battlefield killing is plausible and supported by conflict records, but not proved osteologically. Betrayal is possible and politically sensible, but lacks decisive documentary confirmation. In forensic terminology, we have converging circumstantial evidence, but no direct osteological attribution to Vlad himself. It is worth reflecting on what kinds of material evidence would settle the question, and why those traces are absent. An identified corpse with markers matching known wounds, securely radiocarbon dated to the period, and contextually associated with artifacts that could be linked to Vlad, such as personal regalia with a clear chain of custody, would be decisive.
Absent that, we rely on patterns. Who benefits politically, how contemporary accounts cluster, and whether material finds corroborate those accounts. The archaeology of the impalement fields helps us here not by revealing Vlad's fate, but by showing the character of the man's tools for power. He was an actor who used visible, engineered violence as policy. That method made him both effective and dangerously isolated. Effectiveness in the short term generated enemies for the long term. There is also the matter of source bias. Ottoman chronicles were written with the advantage of imperial perspective, and sometimes a rhetorical need to demonstrate imperial supremacy. European letters could be sensational, written to secure patron support or to explain complex fronts. Wallachian or Hungarian chronicles often served internal legitimating purposes. Forensic historians must hold these biases in view, separating reportage from rhetorical flourish. Where archaeological data corroborates, post-hole geometry, soil anomalies, human remains with trauma, confidence increases. Where archaeology is silent, the textual record stands alone and must be tempered. What does this reconstruction tell us about power and its limits? The impalement forest is instructive. It was an instrument designed to calibrate fear into obedience, a policy tool that produced tactical gains. Yet the tool also generated collateral political effects. It alienated neighbors, destabilized alliances, and presented a ruler who had to maintain spectacle to remain effective. The final irony is stark. The same method that allowed Vlad to hold off better-armed invaders in moments may have contributed to the processes that left him exposed. Isolated from reliable allies, a target for both external enemies and internal rivals. Violence as administration can succeed, and success spectacularly. It can also corrode the social substrates that sustain power. We end as we began, with a sensory return to that ridge outside Târgoviște. The wind moves across the plain, and the image that stays is not of gore, but of message. A designed landscape meant to be read, a polity enforced through display. Forensic reconstruction gives us a way to read the fragments, soil, bones, dispatches, and partisan chronicles, and to assemble a plausible account of a violent end. But it also reminds us of the limits of reconstruction. Medieval contexts rarely preserve the single clarifying artifact we might wish for. Instead, we interpret probability, weigh motives, and distinguish evidentiary streams. If this forensic window into the past changed how you see Vlad and the logic of power, subscribe and share. Our next episode will examine how his reputation shaped Eastern Europe long after his death.